En nog een moeilijk wat danken voor alle goede verbonden dat in de staat zijn en heden jetzt voor een dokter te heden broeden de zaken gaan aanleiden.
Chayim Aruchim probiert zu tun als al-pi halucha, und zu suchen Menschen, als sei sollen tun al-pi halucha. Uns haben nicht, Rav Ausch bei uns, ein Poskim in der Arbeit mit Chayim Aruchim, aber ein Mensch, jeder Mensch soll wissen, dass wenn sie kommt zu solchen Schalen, müssen wir fragen die Schalen. So du hast gesagt mal, Menschen verstehen nicht, also darf kein Zerruf. Sie meinen, als der Doktor sucht, hat der Doktor gesucht, und das ist die ganze Sache. Aber unsere ganze Pflicht ist zu suchen, als man da fragen. Also darf man haben, einen Ruf zu fragen, hätten sie schicken, mit sie helfen, wo sie davon haben. Aber es soll ganz sein eigener Ruf.
So there was an article that appeared in the very prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine. And it said that the proper way for an institution to work was to categorize cancer patients in 4 ways. A, B, C, D. D meant you can garnish tun. Don't do anything for them, finished. C meant that you could give them some pain medicine. And A and B were those who could be cared for. I was an attending physician there. And every time a patient of mine came into the hospital, the young doctor would call me, before they ever saw the patient, before they got the history, and they would say to me, A, B, C, D? Well, do you think we should call this patient? One day, I will tell you that in every floor there was a doctor's office, and there was a blackboard, and on the blackboard was every patient's name. And next to every patient's name was A, B, C, or D. One day a reporter came from the New York Post, and he took a picture of one of the blackboards, and they put it on the front page of the New York Post. The next day, all the doors to the doctor's offices were closed, but it was too late. The story had gotten out. And what happened that influenced each and every one of you as a result of that story? What happened was the state legislature said, you can't rely on doctors to make the final decision about who will live or die. And they passed a law that said that either the patient himself, if he's aware, or the family members would have to make the decision. And that's where the law came called DNR, do not resuscitate. Nobody could say, don't try to bring the patient back unless it was a family member. Now, why is that so important? Because once the DNR was signed, especially in those days, once the DNR was signed, the patient really didn't get proper medical care. So the DNR is something that they ask you all the time. People call up and say, should you sign? Can I sign DNR? Can I not sign DNR? And really the issue is, what is the patient up to? If there's hope, if there are things that can be done, then you shouldn't sign the DNR because it gives the doctors a message. On the other hand, if it's at the very end, you should sign DNR because there's no reason to start plugging the patient when the patient is unconscious and on a respirator and nothing can be done. But nevertheless, that was the first time that the patient and his family were given the right to decide what they wanted to do. I think I'm not being unfair if I call the palliative care services friends of the Malach HaMotos. And he was admitted to the hospice. When I came there, next to his bed was a big pitcher of water. There was so much water there. The water was right there next to his bed. But he was fast asleep. He wasn't drinking that water at all because they were taking care of his pain. They were giving him morphine because they were kind. They were taking care of his pain. So he couldn't drink the water. So I said to the nurse, I said, why don't we put him on an IV? She said, all right. I said, 75 cc's an hour. So she looked at me. She said, what about 20 cc's an hour? Meaning, it looks like an IV, but it doesn't do a thing. So I said to her, I said, I admitted this person to hospice, not to Auschwitz. And the word got around that I had said that. So when you look at that situation, you say to yourself, how do they get rid of people in 5 days? You stop giving them water And that's how you get rid of them in 5 days. You can do it. You won't go to jail. You can do it. It's possible. You can do it. Right? So there's a story of someone whose days were counted, but thank God she lived, and I must tell you, about a year and a half. There's another little story that might give you a little inspiration, a little thought. This was a 12-year-old girl who had thyroid cancer. Now you know that 98% do very well with thyroid cancer, but unfortunately this little girl did not, and the disease began to spread to her lungs. So she was, at that time, under care at New York Hospital. She got worse. So the Dr. Hurley, who's well known for his treatment with radiation therapy of thyroid cancer, sent her to Dr. Tuttle at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Dr. Tuttle gave her, there was no standard therapy, gave her one therapy, and she didn't do well. He said, I could give her a Taxol, but if I do, she's going to die as soon as she gets it. So she was transferred to the National Cancer Institute for the experimental drug. And she went there, and unfortunately, she didn't respond at all. So you know the other person who played a role in this, Yitzi Twersky. So Yitzi had kept calling me all the time, and he said, what can we do? She's only 15. What are we going to do to this girl? She was now 15. What are we going to do? Now you realize I'm an adult doctor. I don't take care of pediatrics. But there was no one ready to see her. It was the end. So I saw her. She came to my office, and very thin. She was on oxygen. She was on constant oxygen. Weak looking. But I happened to have some danishes, some kosher danishes there. And so I offered it to her, and she ate it with relish. She ate it with joy, which is not what happens at the end of life. So I went through, I got the tests, I did all the tests. I found out that her calcium was sky high. There's a reason. They had given her too much calcium, much too much calcium. And I called up a doctor who's a pediatrician, an endocrinologist at Mount Sinai. He was a pediatric endocrinologist. I said, listen, this is a wonderful girl. I'd like to do what I can. So we decided to cut the thyroid level in half. We stopped the calcium entirely. He promised me that if she would have to go to the hospital, she would be admitted under his bed at Mount Sinai as a pediatrician. And within 3 weeks, she was strong enough to go on a High Lifeline trip to Orlando, Florida, with her family, and they said she ran faster than any of her family. Now, the story was a very good story until very recently. She was my patient for 8 years, and during that 8 years, she traveled to Advertisement. Israel. She did many, many, many things. Recently, the disease progressed, and so we had her waiting for a lung transplant, and she died in Pittsburgh. We had the schus to have this person live for an extra 8 years. There was a person who would not have had that privilege. And her life can be attributed, the lengthening of her life, not to one person, but to an attitude, to our attitude, that every moment is important. And what she accomplished in those years, those 8 years, in terms of encouraging others, was unbelievable.
Wir haben Chayim Aruchim hat 2 Menschen, was arbeiten für sie, Aaron Weisfeld in Reberish Fried. Was is the telephone number is in the folder. And man kann sie rufen, wenn man darf sie haben. And sie wollen machen sicher, dass sie sein Bekesher mit der Hospital, mit der Halacha, mit Ravausha bedarf haben. Mit den Lawyers, als man darf haben, Lawyers, als the hospital will nicht hin, was man darf hin.
Ich barchi, gegeben, die Brüche, so es ist steht, hat der Brüche ist in das Loch, gegeben, versarische Abrumowini.
Baruch Hashem, es ist noch als flacket noch al kolpunem a stückle pintele Jiddischkeit chotschen dem. Aber für unsere Machne basindes, als man hat das Dokument, es ist eine gewaltige Yeshia. Wusste die ganze Dokument, es ist nicht keine große Sache, es ist eine Harshua. It's an appointment of an agent. Memana, a Mensch, beschreibt, ich will herankicken in the halachic medical directive. The first paragraph says appointment of agent. Das heißt, man ist Memana a Shliach. Ein Mensch sucht das, also wie es kennen sein, als der Tamulkim in der Zeit, als ich will nicht kennen machen meine eigenen Decisions. So bemeile bin ich Memana jetzt a Shliach, pleini, als soll sein, mein Shliach, in machen the decisions in Mannum. Wir danken alle der Rabunen, die sind durch hergekommen haben. Es ist für uns ein mördiges Schiss. Also uns haben wir die Gelegenheit, zu treffen mit der Rabunen, als durchreden, die Chushe und Junim, so uns Leibische helfen. Und sollen alle gebencht werden mit Chayim Aruchim, alle die Bruches. Und für die letzte Bruche,
helfen dem alle Ariche Simon mit Schulen Teub, da habe ich schon mal Chalas. Leute haben cool zu gehen Schleimen. Schoi.
Pachet